Hello and welcome to today's webinar, A Digital Thread, Capitalize on Your Data's Value. I'm Wade Roush. I'm a technology journalist and audio producer based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, I'd like to tell you briefly about our topic for today and introduce our speakers. In the digital age, every medium to large business has just vast amounts of data stored across many different silos. And that siloing usually means employees have to spend lots of time just finding and accessing the most up-to-date information. Think of a modern manufacturer, for example, that makes physical stuff. Not only do they have to manage data about the stuff and the customers buying and using the stuff, but they also have to manage data about the machines that make the stuff and the employees who run the machines, not to mention all the marketing and sales and strategy discussions that keep the whole enterprise going. Companies that find ways to connect and share all these different kinds of data will be much more competitive in the future. And digital thread is one of the terms that's emerging for this unified and democratized view of the data. Today, we're joined by two speakers who are going to help us understand the digital thread concept. The first is Raghav Narsalay, who is a managing director at Accenture Research and global research lead for Accenture's Industry X. His team works with Accenture's strategy and consulting practices to ensure that clients going through the digital transformation always have access to actionable data-driven insights. And then we'll hear from Catherine Kniker, known to her colleagues as CK, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer at PTC, which is, of course, the Boston-based software company specializing in computer-aided design, product lifecycle management, augmented reality, and the Internet of Things. At PTC, CK is responsible for overseeing key strategic functions, including strategy, M&A, alliances, corporate marketing, and education. PTC and Accenture have been working together extensively to flesh out the whole concept of digital thread. And Raghav and CK are here to tell us more about what digital thread means and why it's so critical to the success of digital transformation efforts. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker, Raghav. Raghav, welcome.
Thank you, Wade. Thanks a lot for that kind introduction. Hello and welcome. This is Raghav, as Wade just described. And Accenture, on behalf of Accenture, let me thank PTC and MIT SMR Connections for having us here today with you. Well, if I were to kind of describe, right, the story of the need for a digital thread, then the best way to describe it concisely is with three V's: volume, variety, and velocity. Actually, let us start with this volume proposition. As you can see, from 2013 to 2020, the digital universe of data has just catapulted. It's just grown 16 times approximately, and that too in terms of zettabytes. By the way, to just remind you, 1 zettabyte is about 10 raised to 21 bytes. So this exponential explosion of data is largely because of the number of devices that are producing it. And these devices are becoming increasingly affordable to a normal consumer as well as to businesses. And a very classic example of that is that of a business sensor, which was costing approximately about $1.30 US in about 2004. And by 2018, the price had dropped to $0.44. So volume of data is multiplying, and by 2025, as you can see on this chart, because of this explosion of data generating devices, it's going to become 180 zettabytes. And that's huge, isn't it? Let's come to the story of variety. And I think this is where a lot of complications actually are going to arise, which is, as we can see, if we move on this chart from the left, or this diagram from the left to the right, which is phase 1 to phase 4, earlier, the business executives, kind of were only dealing with functional data. And that was largely emanating from one function, such as say R&D and design, or, kind of manufacturing. But over a period of time, as you can see, when you start going to the right, the functions have started interacting, then come the ecosystem, and then the ecosystem and the enterprise starts interacting. And once the whole network comes into the picture, the whole value network comes into the picture, essentially the data starts becoming increasingly complex. And what really adds a very distinct flavor to the variety of data when it enters that value network phase is the growing importance of this new product and service innovation with the rise of what we call as the new age business models, what some of my friends would call servitization of production and manufacturing. So here, we are not talking anymore about simple product data, but about product use data, about customer engagement data, about warranty data, about maintenance data that needs to flow across different parts of the product cycle, across different functions, and over the entire operating value chain, as well as the ecosystem and outside. So now, not only are we dealing with volume, but we are dealing with a large variety of data. And then comes the very interesting dimension of velocity. And the velocity dimension of data is largely about executives demanding real-time insights. And as we all know, this has never been so important as in COVID times. If you read this slide, you will see that several surveys are actually showing how real-time data is critical to navigating disruptions such as COVID. And more executives are wanting to use both internal and external data real time to rethink the ways they want to deliver growth. And why not? Because if it was not for the velocity of data, if the data wouldn't have traveled so quickly and to different locations, we wouldn't have been actually getting the vaccines, right? Which we have, kind of developed in record time. We wouldn't have been able to build, prototype, and build and, kind of at scale manufacture those respiratory devices, those hospital equipments specifically required to serve COVID-19 patients in this, world. I mean, the whole point is that because we have been able to manage to a certain extent this volume of data, this variety of data, and now that this entire velocity of data is being able, we have been able to manage to a certain extent, we've been able to kind of face COVID. But guess what? Senior executives actually have a problem at hand. And at Accenture Research, we do very intensive surveys of senior executives. And in one of the surveys that we've just accomplished, of more than 2,000 executives, kind of spanning 15 industries, what we are seeing is that the executives which are, kind of inundated rather with this high volume, high velocity, and highly, varied data, they are struggling to drive continuous business value. And this is largely because their supply chains, their assets, their plants and operations remain disconnected. Some, in fact, many, in fact, not some, but 72%, as you can see on the right-hand side, say that they're struggling to scale up innovation and innovative digital value. Why? Because once again, their assets, their value chains remain extraordinarily disconnected. So the question is, what must companies be doing towards generating and exchanging that near real-time tangible value with network-wide, multidimensional, diverse data sets? And surely you would say they must be building a mechanism that can help them do that. And that's exactly where the digital thread comes in. Companies, we believe, must actually be building digital threads that create that uninterrupted digital connection across functions, their assets, their customers, their production sites, workforces, products. To do what? To multidirectional, or to enable that multidirectional sharing of information, insight, and intelligence. But then the issue is that what is it that this, kind of digital threads are going to achieve? So digital threads, according to me, will help create that one single source of data truth. And I think when the data of large variety, of high volume, and with high velocity keeps on flowing across the organization, arriving at that set of valuable or useful data, being able to process it in collaboration with the colleagues, with your ecosystem partners, using platforms which are cloud-based, being able to derive value out of it and sharing it near real time with your workforce to keep them more safer, with your customers to ensure that their services are intact and they get the best of outcomes using their devices or products, is the need of the hour, and the digital thread really helps you do that. Essentially, what digital thread does is to solve the remainder of the two V's: visibility and veracity. So with the help of a digital thread, your executives across different functions can now see that data, feel that data, process that data, and create value with it. More importantly, in this day and age, where you're not only dealing with digital data, but you're also dealing with physical data, essentially this digital thread helps you create a loop of this digital and physical world across the life cycle of the product and the services associated with it. So in short, what you end up getting is a very high level of data continuity, which enables your business continuity. What you drive is data-driven collaboration. And most importantly, what you achieve in the end is that intelligent, real-time, data-curated insight, which helps you build value for your business, for your workforce, for your customers, and for society at large. Now, the point is that there is generally a confusion that we see between a digital thread and a digital twin. We believe that basically a digital thread is what I've just spoken, is about linking that product and data and insight and intelligence, spanning functions, assets, customers, production sites, workforce. But a digital twin is only a virtual representation of a tangible and often a physical thing. So if you can imagine virtually, right, or in front of you right now, a digital twin can actually sit on a digital thread along with a cloud, with several platforms, with several applications. And along with all that, the digital thread then ends up creating value for everyone involved. Now, the point is, what should a digital thread, are we really talking about a digital thread with the same characteristic? And this is something which is very important, because executives that we speak to clearly tell us that when you really look at data flows across different functions in an organization, you're really dealing with different kinds of data densities, different kind of data frequencies, and different kind of data pressures. So if you really look at a connection between engineering and manufacturing, you will generally see a very highly dense, pipe of data, high frequency data and very high pressure data, being exchanged. So we need to factor in the density, the frequency, the pressure, and many other attributes of data when we are building that digital thread. Because if you kind of build a digital thread, enabling that connectivity between different functions in your organization, like a one-size-fits-all or with a one-size-fits-all approach, then you might actually end up sometimes underutilizing it, or sometimes that thread can even, break under pressure. It can just get clogged with data, and those functional leaders, that workforce, those managers who want to work and create value with it will get frustrated. So therefore, now that we have discussed this entire conceptual foundation of the digital thread, which is all about the 5 V's, as we just spoke about, 3 which are responsible for the thread, which is about volume, variety, and velocity, and the 2 that are an outcome of the digital thread, which is visibility and veracity. I think it's time now for me to really hand it over to Catherine Kniker from PTC, because let's understand this, that a failure to build a digital thread can put the ROI on investments in digital transformation at a big risk. And to therefore understand why this happens and how you can avoid it, over to you, CK.
Thanks, Raghav. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you today. So Raghav really made the case and described what a digital thread is and why we need to leverage digital threads in our digital transformation initiatives. So here at PTC over the summer, we conducted a survey really to learn more about what impacts success, and conversely, what are the challenges that organizations are having with these digital transformation initiatives with digital thread at the heart of them. And as you can see from the slide, we surveyed a broad range of industries across the globe, and a variety of different company sizes. All of these companies were really trying to leverage digital transformation initiatives across a wide range of goals, from improving productivity to improving product quality, sustainability, supply chain agility and resilience, many of the things that Raghav mentioned. But maybe before I share the findings, why don't I just ask a question just to get a sense of where your organization is in terms of understanding of digital thread, and maybe focus on your organization as opposed to yourself. Just click any one answer. Just want to get a sense for where you're at as I delve into the findings. We'll give it about 30 seconds. All right, quite a good mix from very little understanding of the concept to maybe a smaller number where the concept is well understood. So I hope today's material and this recording will be useful for all of you as you drive maybe your digital thread and digital transformation initiatives within your organization. But all right, so what did we learn? If we move on to the next slide, we found that if we summed it all up, cross-functional collaboration across the product and service lifecycle leads to significantly better ROI from a digital transformation perspective. The survey showed that companies whose different business functions are integrated across the life cycle are 2.5 times more likely to beat their expectations of the initiative. And maybe conversely, they're 12 times less likely to fail. And that is a significant difference to ROI. The survey also revealed that the difference between exceeding and missing digital transformation ROI expectations are that programs that beat expectations do so on an average by beat them by, on an average by 50%, and while programs that miss by 30%. So very significant difference that cross-functional collaboration makes, and that makes sense if you think about what Raghav just showed you, moving from siloed to cross-functional to enterprise, to the value creation, the value network approach. And you know, while it might not be a revelation, 94% of our respondents to the survey either agree or strongly agree that implementing a digital thread is the key to realizing the full benefits of a digital transformation initiative. But it needs to operate across the value chain, maximizing that data, you know, beyond the traditional siloed functional approach. Yet our data would suggest that many aren't doing it well. And so we delved through the data and the responses, and we summarize, you know, that companies who are going about a digital thread initiative and drive value really need to focus on 3 key areas. And I'll go through each of the 3 components, but the 3 components are leadership, technology, and culture. And so if I delve into leadership, you know, we probed on both the level of understanding of senior leaders in the organization and the level of commitment. And what we see is that when company leadership understands digital thread and are committed to that digital thread is a critical component of their future success, those companies' digital transformation initiatives perform significantly better, as you can see on this chart. And when your heads of business and executives have a limited understanding and little commitment, your chances, just like cross-functional collaboration, your chances of missing your ROI skyrocket to 61%. So digital thread champions at the top ensure that these initiatives are aligned across the company, and by promoting cross-functional communication, ensuring the information generated by one organization is leveraged by all, and facilitating this cross-functional collaboration. Not just the sharing of data, but also just the work streams that will, over time, blur organizational boundaries. And so without this leadership, oftentimes we're finding that digital transformation initiatives are lacking that necessary political power to address, you know, what often can occur inter-organizational hurdles. So this can slow progress and obviously lead to the real missed opportunity to maximize the data's value. The second area, technology, was technology. And we had a lot of questions in the survey, not all of which I've summarized here. But you know, we asked a lot about what was both the right approach as well as the key challenges organizations are facing with technology choices. And the right technology approach needed to address these siloed systems, which caused this huge problems for generating value out of data. Many of our respondents said that leads to duplicated efforts, multiple sources of the truth, and data inaccessibility. They also cited that the 3 biggest, I'll say, technology challenges that they're facing when trying to establish a digital thread are either feature function gaps in existing technology solutions that they have. The second was the cost of integration, and the third, the lack of talent for implementation. And you know, I would say, you know, from a feature function gaps, you know, companies some companies are trying to figure out their way out of legacy world. And so, you know, it's forcing them to rethink their software strategy and architecture. And honestly, there's no silver bullet, but I would say maybe the correct strategy relies on really looking at what your starting point is. And, you know, while there was the survey revealed that there's no one size fits all, companies are doing maybe one of two things. They're either consolidating existing systems, or they're wrapping and extending with platforms, or some combination of the two. And when we looked at the data and the responses relative to ROI, we found that both of these approaches work equally well in terms of correlating to ROI. From a cost of integration perspective, you know, you should really think about the vendors that you're leveraging, and you know, if they are building their software with the digital thread concept in mind, and that will show up because they will have built-in integration capabilities and out-of-the-box functionality. You'll also see that a lot of software vendors are working with systems integrators to do add-ons that can be repeated over and over again for companies, so that the pre-built solutions are already in place, and you get that much faster time to value and reduce that cost of integration. And maybe one last thing I'd say on the cost of integration: really be careful in your choice of software, that you're not buying from, you know, a closed vendor, software vendor, and rather really looking at vendors that have an open API approach. And then that last big challenge that we saw in the survey was the lack of talent. And this certainly is a challenge to get digital transformation experts who can work across platforms. I would say all of the major software vendors are doing a pretty good job at accrediting and training programs, and really making that training widely available. Another way this challenge is being met is via very knowledgeable large and small systems integrators who have the experience across the platforms. So, you know, there's a lot of systems that are being leveraged, and the reason you see that list of systems being leveraged to find value from their digital transformation initiatives is there's a lot of data sources, and the key here, whether it's product data, process data, people data, or place data, is to really understand the data that you truly need, and really capture that, as opposed to trying to make sense of all of the data that you have. All right, so that was technology. The other key finding that we had, or the key area, was this whole area of culture and ownership at every level of digital transformation initiatives. Because if you don't have ownership at every level, the projects seem to stumble. And you know, this is quite tied to that finding that we had at the very beginning, the cross-functional collaboration. But you need both bottoms up and tops down would be the finding that we see here. You see the difference in ROI, and again, the difference in missing the ROI expectations. So the bottoms up functional view will give you the real detail around what are use cases, what is the actual operational benefits that I could get at a use case level across functions, whereas the strategic benefits will tie to the long-term strategy of the company and really have that executive horsepower behind the initiative. So very strong recommendation to have a very holistic combined approach, where, you know, there's agency within functions, but really the goal is the sharing of data across the organization. And maybe one caution here from me would be that this ownership and this cultural change, particularly in larger organizations, doesn't happen by chance. It requires a major mind shift for many companies. So, because, to drive this collaboration, you need collaboration requires diverse inputs, which may not be usual operating mode for a lot of companies, whether that's roles or departments driving the collaboration. Collaboration requires a much more agile and iterative approach. And like I said earlier, it needs to span boundaries. And maybe with the volume and velocity of data, this collaboration has to be nonstop because you will get new insights on a consistent basis, and you really need this culture of collaboration to be nonstop. So if you're shifting or trying to ensure a culture of collaboration, it really needs constant care and feeding. And, I would strongly recommend, anybody heading down this journey to put time into having a change management initiative and really focus on this component. We often, and ourselves as software vendors, we tend to focus on the software, but a lot of the soft skills around these initiatives is equally, if not more, important. So if we pull that all together, Raghav, if we go to the next slide, Raghav talked about the building digital threads. Our survey data would show you that the 3 areas that are super critical are leadership, technology choices with openness in mind, and this culture top to bottom of collaboration as the critical success factors in figuring out which digital threads to build in what order, and therefore your digital twin becomes even more valuable with more and more data and insight that is gained from the digital thread if it's reflected back in the digital twin. So you really need all these areas. So maybe now, rather than talk about it in a theoretical sense, we wanted to show you a company that exemplifies what successful digital transformation initiative looks like. And we could pick many, but we picked this one. It's one that my colleagues and Accenture worked on together, and I hope it leaves you licking your lips, as it were. So the Shelly Group is a leading solution provider of dispensing equipment in water, beer, and soft drink industry. So what that means is they design, manufacture, and service equipment for this space. The Shelly Group set out on their digital initiative to transform the industry, and they called their initiative Teledraft. And it really was centered around gathering data from the dispensing equipment to provide it to all the stakeholders throughout the distribution chain. So, just to put that in perspective, every time you walk up to a bar or a restaurant and order a draft beer or a soft drink on tap, your first sip of that crisp, refreshing beverage is actually the last step in a lengthy supply chain journey. In keeping with local markets, large beverage companies buy drink dispensers like taps and coolers from manufacturers to provide them to the bars and restaurants around the world. Yet many times those beverage companies, that quote unquote last mile of the supply journey, remains a complete mystery. Critical information like what factors impacted the beverage quality and which drinks are on demand is completely lost. And so without that visibility without the visibility into the health of their equipment, the beverage companies don't know how and when their dispensers break, or if if they're operating at peak performance. So as a result, a lot of these beverage companies struggle to control the quality of the drinks, ensure the equipment uptime, and manage inventory efficiently. And so the Shelly Group was actually seeking to radically differentiate itself. And by leveraging technology and innovation to provide a lot more value to the stakeholders in their distribution chain, improve their brand, etc. So how did they leverage the 3 key elements that I spoke about earlier that we saw in the survey? So they, from a leadership perspective, they hired in a commercial director new to the company, but had spent 12 years in Microsoft Cloud. So not a normal or usual hire for the Shelly Group. And the Shelly CEO was determined to take the company on this digital transformation journey. So he knew that he needed to bring in outside thinking and expertise. And so that combination really was very clear to everybody. This had full backing and support of the CEO. From a technology perspective, it was, easier maybe than some, because they had already, they were using 3D from PTC, 3D and Windchill for product development, and they added our IoT ThingWorks offering so that they could capture the IoT connectivity and IoT enabled applications for managing the assets and the supply chain. And then they worked with Accenture to build out these data models to really understand what we could learn from the data sensors, whether it was the data sensors on the taps or historical field data on analytics. Together, we had the features so that we didn't really suffer from some of the issues that you see. And then from a culture perspective, everything about Shelly Group changed. Everybody realized that the value proposition was the way that they were going to differentiate. They created an entire new asset management division, and they were able to deliver this digital enhanced solution. And from a success perspective, I won't read the results, but the results speak for themselves. 27% improvement in quality, all the way to an annual increase in the sell-through of digital solutions to their customers. So this is one example. I could talk about it forever, and we could talk about lots more. But hopefully this provides you a practical example of what we found in the survey. So maybe before we open it up for questions, just want to get a sense from you what you think, based on what you heard today, which is the foremost challenge for your company? Is it leadership, is it technology, or is it culture? So if we put up the poll question, it'd be great to see that. All right. Interesting. Culture. And as I mentioned in my comments, while we as technology-minded folks spend a lot of time on technology, culture and leadership are very, very important. And so I would actually concur. This audience is a good distribution of what we see happen in reality, and this culture component, we can't underestimate it enough, and it's probably the hardest one. So I'm sure we can chat some more about that. But why don't I hand it back? Thank you all for taking the time, and I'd love to open it up for questions.
Great, great. Thank you so much, CK, and thank you, Raghav. So we do have some great questions coming in from the audience, and we'll continue to take those questions for the remainder of the hour. Audience members, you can submit questions using the GoToWebinar control panel. Just go to the questions module. To kick things off, I have a question that relates to the poll result we just saw. So culture was way out in front as the big barrier everyone is most concerned about. And you told us that great story about Shelly Group. Do you have other examples of companies that manage through the challenges around implementing a digital thread particularly well? And is there a formula for doing that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll have Raghav join me. You know, I mentioned it in my comments that I really think when you set off on a thread-based digital transformation journey, and to be honest, most digital transformation journeys are digital thread-based, because it's that value through the value chain that's so important. You should seriously consider, as a core pillar of your digital transformation initiative, to have a change management. You can call it culture management, you can call it change management, but like, what's the to from state that we want to achieve? And companies who set up their program with one of these pillars really end up having a lot of success, because there is a very natural tendency to say, well, how do I grab the data? Where do I grab the data? What's the best tool to do that? But really understanding that, you know, if functions have been so used to data was power in many cases, that if you don't address that up front, it won't be, you won't have a successful initiative. Raghav, would you have additional comments on that?
First of all, thanks, CK, for a great presentation. I think, you know, one of the greatest management authors has written, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Absolutely.
And it's the truth. You can have the greatest of transformation programs inked on paper, but if they don't enjoy the ownership of the people, especially the workforce, the middle management, who are actually soiling their hands with data, then you can build a great thread, but who's going to run it? Who's going to weave value with it? And that's the whole point. So I've seen companies where essentially, instead of focusing a lot on, you know, the technology tools to begin with, they largely focus on getting people ready to understand that technology, ask them what value do they see, you know, being created with it. If there is a requirement of, you know, trainings, if there is a requirement of ecosystem support to drive that, they do engage with that, and then they go whole hog into this entire, you know, kind of transformation exercise. And these are large industrial equipment companies within Europe, you know, some of the companies in US, and most of the times these companies have really focused. They've really given a large focus on first ensuring that people are on board, and only when the people are onboarded do they, you know, kind of go and run the transformation engine with digital technologies and start building the thread with it.
Mm-hmm. Was Shelly Group an example of one of those hybrid kind of bottoms up, top down places where there was somebody actually owning the change?
For sure. You know, they brought in, so you had clear leadership from the CEO level, who brought in a person to lead the initiative, so new blood into the company. But then they built this whole realization of the value that would be created for their customers and the customers' customers, and so you know, it got that groundswell of support every which way, and it impacted not just it impacted every piece of the value chain. It impacted them selling more, so salespeople were interested in it. It impacted the serviceability, so the downtime of taps and stuff. So the service group was interested. So everybody saw that the value of this major change really was impactful to not only their function but the broader company.
Okay. Going to audience questions, we've gotten a couple of questions about this challenge of breaking down silos between different kinds of data. So could each of you talk a little more about how we can use a digital thread model to break down those silos? And if you have stories and examples, those are always kind of the best way to explain, I think.
Go ahead.
Great. Okay, so I think you're right. Silos are, kind of the biggest enemy of digital success, and digital threads actually allow us to break that silos. And I think CK referred to a very interesting point in a presentation, which is data is power, right? So you're basically sitting on data as a function, which is say maybe design, and then you're not sharing it with manufacturing, or you're just keeping it so that the manufacturing function kind of comes back to you again and again and again to get value from you. But this is exactly the point, right? I mean, then once you have a thread, right, the data is on a platform, right? Now the point is, it's not that you've lost your control over it, but you are now supposed to create value with it in collaboration with others, because the incentive, right, and this is the whole point, right, humans need incentive, right? The ROI is now not going to be described of how much greater or best design do you create in isolation, but is going to be defined by how customer centric your design is, and how well do you transmit that design into onto the manufacturing shop floor, so that they can build that product which is highly customer centric. So your metrics, the change in metrics when a digital thread comes in to measure your ROI, becomes the driver to drive better collaboration, and that's how people start working together. So they start then interacting with one another. So say, for example, the sales guys now want to talk to the design guys. Probably, they wouldn't have spoken earlier, right? Because I'm sales, you're design, what has this got to do? But the point is, now because the incentive has changed, as a result of that, the sales guys become far more interactive with the design guys, and they also see now value in even talking to the procurement guys. Because the point is, if I'm not going to procure the right material, so imagine that my customer is now very, very climate sensitive, right? And this is a big theme now. I mean, all products, I mean, customers really want climate sensitive products in their hand, climate friendly products in their hand. Now, if my product design is actually based initially on a climate unfriendly input, but now, and I was not really interacting with the sales guys because I really don't know anything about it, then I was kind of doing all this. But now my products are getting rejected thanks to the climate friendliness, growing climate friendliness within the customers. Now the sales guys share that with the design guys share that with the procurement guys, and they have to then kind of share it even with the manufacturing, because it's a new raw material now that comes into the picture, which may be requiring a new way of manufacturing things. So now you see the whole shift happens and people start sharing data with one another.
Okay. I want to keep things moving just to get through as many questions as possible. So we have a question about whether digital thread initiatives work better in particular verticals. So we've talked a little bit about beverage distribution example. We've talked a little bit about manufacturing. Do you think that the idea applies equally well to any industry, or are there specific ones that can benefit most?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Raghav add to my comments. So we spend here at PTC, we spend a lot of time with discrete manufacturers of all industries, whether it's aerospace and defense, medical devices, high tech and electronics, or whatever. Digital thread applies equally to all of them, and because you need the design data from as designed as manufacturer and as it lives. And so, we spend maybe less time in the process space, and I'd have Raghav comment on that. Certainly, across the distribution chain, et cetera, it's extremely important in those industries. But there isn't an industry from a discrete manufacturer, discrete or hybrid manufacturer, where it's not important, and where we see initiatives every day. Raghav, would you have anything additional to say on that?
Great, CK. I think we need to also recognize, right, that the entire notion of industry is changing, right? I mean, let's recognize that. So you earlier had automotive, now you have mobility. Now, as soon as that transformation starts happening, right, your entire product, the value behind it, the services that have to go with it, the inputs to it dramatically change. And as a result of that, that discrete has now become a continuous industry. Right. And as a result of that, these are the transformations, the industrial transformations that are making the digital thread more relevant than ever before, right? Let's recognize this. And I think you will see this also, for example, nobody is talking about finance as an industry anymore. People are talking about, kind of very specific things like, can you service me? Can you give me a financial service? And that will get very specific. So this whole thing about industries transforming themselves from discrete to continuous, from continuous to something kind of which is I would say confluence based, are really changing are opening up new vistas for digital thread is what I can say.
Speaking of services, could either one of you speak to whether digital thread would be useful in a hospital or healthcare or even a life sciences environment? Have you got any partners testing it out in those areas?
I mean, a digital thread is a fantastic thing, especially during COVID. I mean, there are live examples of companies who have established, as I was talking about, in my own, exposition, which is that without that, kind of a thread, maybe it's not really mature at this moment, but they did build a thread. They did go ahead and build a thread. Why? Because they needed that data from an hospital, right, as to what customers or what the patients really wanted, right? Now that was a completely different equipment for, for maybe for breathing, or, kind of a different kind of a cup to be held, or a different nose cap, whatever, which was never made, had to be made of a different material, which they had never processed, right? They needed a design specification, which had to be done not 5 months, in 3 days, right? And then had to be manufactured at scale, tested, once again come back to the manufacturing floor, and then kind of manufactured and distributed all across different hospitals. All this could not have happened without a thread, right?
And so it's really coming from the manufacturer side, and what value and how they can deliver the value. Like, so in that case, the hospital is an endpoint that's delivering. It's kind of how is their equipment or their whatever pharmacological vaccine or medicine is being used. That's the endpoint feedback to close the loop. But I assure you, every medical device and pharma company has digital thread initiatives underway.
Okay, could just a very quick question about digital twin, which you mentioned, CK. Is there a good reason to try and synchronize efforts to build digital twins of your processes and also build a digital thread? How do those two things fit together?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll take a crack at it. Raghav had the actual definitions in the presentation, and I completely agree with his definition that the digital twin being the actual digital representation of the product. The digital thread, though, very much interacts with the digital twin. The better digital thread that you have, the richer your digital twin becomes over time, because you keep adding that data, that insight that you're getting. You can actually add it to the virtual representation. And so it's really, they're two very symbiotic concepts. And so you should think about both. And then that's on the, let's say, if you're thinking about the product, but you should also think about spaces, places. And so, you know, we spend a lot of time in our augmented reality and spatial initiatives, really thinking about places. So you think about product, people, processes, and places. So, you know, Raghav had the 5 V's. I would say I have the 4 P's.
Awesome.
And all of those things could wrap together.
Okay, I want to jump in with a final lightning round question. Each of you please answer in the length of a tweet, which I guess is 280 characters these days. What's the one thing companies need to know to successfully adopt a digital thread approach?
I would say leadership, technology, and culture that came out of the survey and this notion of cross-functional collaboration.
Great. Raghav?
I would say, yeah, I would say, you know, leadership-driven ownership of data across the organization.
Okay, I think those were both tweet-worthy.
Maybe mine was a little too long. I'll have to work on my tweeting.
It was close. It was very close. Okay. Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank everyone who sent in a question, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I want to thank both of our speakers, Raghav and CK, and thank you to our audience today as well. Over the next few days, you can look for a feedback survey that we'll be sending out via email, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts and opinions about today's webinar, a recording of which will be available also within 3 to 4 business days, and we'll let you know how to access that. We'll send out a link to the recording as well as a PDF of the slides you saw today. So one final thank you to our sponsor, PTC. This is an important topic, and we appreciate PTC's leadership in this area. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.